Well, Tyler, congratulations on finishing VBS this week. Just want to talk to you, have a little bit of a wrap up. How do you think it went?
It was a great week. We covered a lot of ground. So we started in Genesis 12 and we got all the way through Genesis 22. Covering 10 chapters, 11 chapters in a week is a lot. So it felt pretty fast paced at times. Covered a lot of ground with these students. But I think it went really well. I think we were able to emphasize some particular themes throughout the week, and we just had our closeout assembly with everybody, with parents there too, and I think it was really a wonderful time of fellowship at the end and reflecting on some of the things that we learned throughout the week. And the students are always really excited. I had couple of the students say things like, "I want to do VBS forever." So, which is fun. We do a lot of fun things throughout the week. They play a lot of games and get to do fun crafts, and so there's a lot of excitement around it, which is great.
I think it helps having not just the teaching, but you have games, crafts. I saw you guys doing music as well.
Yeah.
So kind of having a well-rounded thing. You're not just in there doing heady theology with first graders all day.
Right. Yeah.
But you did cover some things, so I'd love to talk with you about kind of a day-by-day, what you guys went through. Obviously, you went through 10 chapters, so we're not going to go into a whole lot of detail here. But what kind of did you cover?
So the theme for the week was the life of Abraham, and one of the things that we emphasized was from Romans chapter 4, where Paul says that Abraham did not waver at the promises of God. So even when Abraham couldn't see the promises being fulfilled, he did not waver. And so we talked about that being sort of the courageous faith of Abraham. And so that was probably the theme that we brought up the most as we're weaving through all these different stories. And so we started in Genesis 12 on Monday with the promises given to Abraham. He's called out of Ur, which is a pagan people. He's called out from there and he's given these promises and told to leave his homeland as he's being given these promises. And so that's the beginning of it. And those promises then are repeated throughout these different stories. God comes and he speaks to Abraham at different times, reminding him of these promises over and over again. And Abraham, we're told in Hebrews also that Abraham never sees the fulfillment of these promises. He gets little glimpses. But just as an example, he's promised the land of Canaan. But Abraham and his descendants never own the land of Canaan until several centuries later when Israel comes back to the land of Canaan and God delivers it to them. Abraham owns a little plot of land at the end that he's buried in, that Sarah is buried in. And that's it. That's all that he owns. And then he's given this promise that he's going to be the father of many nations. But he has one son, well, two sons, but one that's the promised son, Isaac, by the end. So there's these promises, and Abraham, what we see Abraham doing throughout is believing God, trusting God, and resting on those promises throughout these stories. We emphasized also in that first day that Abraham, in the different places that he goes to, he builds altars. And he's building these altars as places of worship for the true God in this pagan land. And it's as though he's setting them up as these, outposts almost of this is God's land, this is God's world, this is God's land that he has promised to Abraham's descendants, to God's people. And it's going to be his one day. There's just kind of these little outposts for worshiping the true God. And that comes up throughout. What's interesting is some of those altars end up being tied to significant battles that get fought in the conquest of Canaan. So you have that connection where it's almost as though Abram's planting seeds of this is going to be the land of God's people. And then that happens later on when Israel comes back and takes over. So those are the things that we really emphasized that first day. Along with, there's the story of when Abram and Sarai go down to Egypt, and Abram tells Sarai to pretend to be his sister, or to say that she is his sister, which is in part true. She's his half-sister, technically speaking. They have the same father but different mothers. But a lot of commentators will take that story and talk about it, and sort of use it as a morality tale of how Abram failed because he lied, and because he lies, then Sarai is taken by the Pharaoh and into his house, and so there's this sort of you shouldn't lie like Abraham and falter that way. As you look at the story, that's not really how the story goes. There's maybe some questions around it, but Abram says to Sarai, pretend to me, or say that you're my sister. And he does so, I think, in a way that he is stepping in. It's actually him stepping in front of her, because in those days it was the brother who was responsible for the courtship interaction. Mm-hmm. We see that happen later on in the Old Testament too. And so it's actually, I think, in some ways a defensive move where he's putting himself in, they're going to have to go through me and negotiate with me if they're even going to want to talk to you, is the idea. Instead, they would have just killed Abram if he was, if he was Sarai's husband. But there's all these questions about whether or not Abram should have done that. At the end, though, Abram is blessed and Pharaoh is cursed with the plagues. And so there's no clear judgment from God on Abram's actions. That comes up again later on. We talked about it very briefly on Thursday, when Abraham and Sarah now go to a different region, and there's the king there, Abimelech, and same sort of scenario happens where he takes Sarah into his house. Abram says that tells Sarah to say that she is his sister. And we find out that that's been their MO as they've been traveling around. Abram says, we've always done this to protect ourselves as we've been traveling around. And so it seems like it's not like that happened in Egypt and then Abram learned a good lesson and didn't do that anymore, or that it happened in Egypt and things didn't go well, but he didn't learn his lesson and he did it again with Abimelech. It's almost as though, no, that's actually the way that they've been doing it, and God continues to bless them through that. So there's still some questions around it, but we talked about that a little bit and tried to not just jump to right away, this is a morality tale about not lying, because it's not a good morality tale if that's the case.
Right.
So that was Monday. Tuesday, we spent some time talking about Abram and Lot when they're deciding who should take what part of the land. There's this conflict between them. Abram gives Lot the choice, and Lot ends up going towards the really lush, fruitful land. It's described as the garden of the Lord, or it's like the garden of the Lord, but it's near Sodom. Abram goes the other direction, and God tells him to look around everything he can see. That's the land that I'm going to give you. So there's this repetition of that land promise, and then a repetition of that he's going to make Abram a great nation as well. And then we talked about a great fun story where Abram goes to war. You have this great story of these 4 kings that are these powerful kings from kind of outside the region of Canaan and the surrounding regions, sort of, a good bit further east and north. And they wage war against these 5 kings that are more in the land of Canaan area, near the Salt Sea, or the Dead Sea. And they end up enslaving them or oppressing them, and for many years they serve these other kings. Chedorlaomer is the name of the king who's the kind of the leader of the group. And then these 5 kings, though, they end up rebelling. Chedorlaomer comes and to put them in their place. And on the way, we're told that he also conquers these other peoples, some of whom we find out later are peoples of the giants. So they have giants that live there. So Chedorlaomer is this powerful king who's able to conquer the giants. He defeats these 5 kings, including the king of Sodom, and he captures Lot in the process, and they go. He takes them off. Abram finds out about this, and so he goes on a rescue mission to rescue Lot with a small band of 318 soldiers. And God delivers his enemies into his hand. He rescues Lot, brings them all back. And then he meets this character that we don't know a whole lot about named Melchizedek. Kind of comes out of nowhere. He's this great high priest of God Most High. His name means King of Righteousness. He's the King of Salem, which is the early version of Jerusalem, which means peace. So he's the King of Righteousness, the King of Peace, priest of God Most High. He's this great foreshadowing of Jesus. And Hebrews tells us that he is the one who is the priestly line that Jesus comes from. Jesus is that kind of a priest. He's greater than the priests of Israel, the priests that come from Levi. So we talked about all of that, and lots more to say about all of that, but it was fun to introduce a lot of those things to the students. Talk about Melchizedek, who doesn't show up a whole lot in Scripture, but there's some wonderful questions around him. Then Wednesday, we talked about one of the really well-known stories about Abram is when God takes him out of his tent, tells him to look at the sky and count the stars if you're able to, and that's what your descendants will be like. So Abram's received these promises from God that he's going to be a great nation. God's going to, bless the nations of the earth through him. And Abraham says, God, there's a problem. I don't have any children, and my wife's barren, and I'm getting old. What do you have for, what are you planning to do? And God doesn't give him an answer. directly. He doesn't tell him, here's the plan. But he does say, look at the stars. That's what your descendants are going to be like. He reiterates the promise to him. And we're told that Abram at that time believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. And that was where I talked with the students about there's this connection that the New Testament gives us between us and Abram. And it's that. It's like Abram believed God and it was accounted to him for righteousness. He's justified by his faith. In the same way, we are justified by faith if we have the faith of Abraham. It's always fun to sort of share the gospel with these young saints. And many of them grow up, most of them, I think all of them are in Christian families that grown up in the church. And so they hear it, but it's wonderful for just another opportunity to say, if we believe in God, if you believe in God and you believe in Jesus as your Savior, you have the same faith that Abraham had. And the blessings and the promises that are given to Abraham are also for you because you are the sons and daughters of Abraham. Then there's this weird story of Abram asks God, how do I know that I'm going to inherit this land? God tells him to take these animals and split them in half. And then Abram falls into a deep sleep and sees this vision of a torch and a smoking oven going between the halves. And somehow that's an answer to his question of assurance. Like, how do I know that God is going to keep his word and give me this land? And we talked about how that's actually a relatively common ceremony in ancient times when people would be making a covenant. Say two kings were at war, they want to make a peace treaty, and they make a covenant by splitting animals and passing through them, which says, if I don't keep my promise, let that happen to me. I'll be divided like those animals. And of course, God cannot be divided. And so that is his assurance to Abraham. I'm going to keep my promise because of who I am. Mm-hmm. I cannot be divided. But he gives Abram that assurance. We talked also about, on Wednesday, Hagar and Sarai, this story of how Abram and Sarai kind of seem to take matters into their own hands a little bit with trying to accomplish this promise that God has given them of having children. Sarai knows she can't have children, so she gives Hagar to Abram. Hagar conceives and ends up giving birth to Ishmael. And so then Abraham has this question, like, is this the promised child? Maybe it is. They kind of take matters into their own hands to accomplish it, but there is a child that's born out of it. So we're kind of left with this question of, is Ishmael the guy? Is he the one? And the story goes on then, and we're kind of left with that for a while until we get to I guess it's not that long, but we get to the next chapter. And we find out that at that time, Abram was 86 years old. So he'd been traveling in Canaan for about 10 years, waiting for this promise to be fulfilled, that he's going to have children. Ishmael's born. And then we get to the next chapter, which is 13 years later. So there's this gap of 13 years. So Ishmael is now 13 years old. And it's at that time that God tells Abram, no, actually, this promised son is not Ishmael. It's going to be through Sarah, and you're going to name him Isaac. And Abram, his name is changed from Abram to Abraham, and God tells him that he's going to have this son through Sarah, and Abraham laughs. And then in the next chapter, we'll see also that Sarah, when she overhears a similar conversation, that she's going to have a son, she laughs. And God just says that this son is going to be named Isaac, and Isaac means laughter. And so you have this, because of Abram and Sarah's laughter, that produces this son. And one of the things that brought this out a little bit for the students, but this was more something that it struck me as I was studying through this, and I shared this with all the volunteers, is that while God gives Abraham these promises, and he gives Abraham these promises, and Abraham believes these promises, and he's trusting in God, God doesn't really give him an answer to those promises until Abraham is to the point where it's unbelievable, where he can't believe that that's actually what God's going to do. He's been following God for 25 years at this point, waiting for God to bring this answer, or nearly 25 years. And when God finally says, this is how I'm going to do it, Abraham laughs at it. Says, there's no way, God. And Sarah does the same thing. It's just this interesting picture of how God tells you to trust him, tells you to follow him, and then he'll test you and sort of stretch it out, not to He's not because he's capricious and just messing with you all the time, but it's because he is sanctifying you and showing you how much you need to trust in him. And he takes you all the way to that breaking point, and then he gives you what you need to know. Then he tells you, here's the answer. So we see that happen with Abraham. On Thursday, so we talked about that announcement of Isaac being born, and then the announcement when Sarah also finds out about it, and then Isaac himself is born in chapter 21. There's some things in the middle there that we touched on as well. Talked a little bit about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. We didn't really emphasize it, but referenced it because it's in chapter 18 and 19. And then you have that similar story to Abram and Sarai going down to Egypt again in chapter 20 with Abraham and Abimelech. And again, God blessing Abraham as he leaves Abimelech's house after having received Sarah back. Then we got to the last day. Genesis 22 is what we covered today. And this is probably, one of probably the two best known stories about Abraham are counting the stars, if you're able to, and then this story about Abraham taking Isaac up to Mount Moriah to sacrifice him. So God, sometime later, probably 10 or so years later, maybe more, Isaac is old enough to, in the story, Abraham places a bunch of wood on him to carry up the mountain. So he's no longer an infant. He's old enough to be able to haul a bunch of wood up the mountain. So, at least probably 10 years old. God tells Abraham to take his only son, this son that he loves, and take him up to Mount Moriah and offer him as a burnt offering. And that's particularly striking because Abraham has been waiting for this promised son for so long. God's asking him to kill his only son. God's asking him to sacrifice his only son as a burnt offering, which is a pagan ritual. Abraham lives among Canaanites, some of whom worshipped Molech, and that was one of the main modes of worship, was to offer children as sacrifices. So God's asking Abraham to do crazy things you would imagine that Abraham would be just reeling with both the how do you put it, the emotional request of him to sacrifice his only son, this only son that he's been waiting for so long, and to do so in a way that's really contrary to the God that Abraham has followed. God brought him out of that pagan worship, and now God's sort of asking him to go back to it, it would seem. But Abraham, just the next morning, he gets up early and he goes, and he takes Isaac and a couple servants with him. We talked about how this is clearly a picture of the story of Christ, this only son that is then sent to be a sacrifice. And of course, Abraham takes Isaac up the mountain. They get to the point where he's about to plunge the knife down into Isaac, and God stops him. The angel of the Lord comes and tells him to stop, not to lay a hand on Isaac, and instead provides a ram for the sacrifice. And so all three of these characters, you've got Abraham, Isaac, and this ram. All three of them in different ways point ahead to Jesus. Abraham is told to do this seemingly impossible thing, and yet he trusts God and obeys him all the way to the sacrifice, just like Jesus came in order to take on the sins of the world, and we're told that he obeyed even to the point of the cross, even through death on the cross. He trusted the Father and obeyed him. Isaac is the only son who sacrificed or offered for a sacrifice, just like Jesus is the only son who dies on the cross, offered as a sacrifice. But then also the ram, of course, is the substitute for Isaac. Jesus doesn't go to the cross dying for himself. He goes to the cross dying for his people. He's the substitute. A couple other things that we talked about with this story is Abram calls the name of the place the Lord will provide, and we're told that there's a saying that comes out of that in the mount of the Lord it will be provided. And the students learned this week, or many of them knew it already, but they reviewed Psalm 121, or a version of Psalm 121 that we sing, which begins, "I will lift up mine eyes to the hills from whence comes my help." And I think the psalmist there is thinking of this story. He's thinking of Isaac and Abraham, every time they would see Mount Moriah after this time, what would they think? They would remember that God provided, that he intervened, that he was true to his promises. He had given Abraham these promises that Isaac, and very clear promises that Isaac would be the heir, that he would be the promised son. And Abraham we're told in the New Testament, he believes God's promises to the point where he assumed that if he was going to actually kill Isaac, that God was going to raise Isaac from the dead. He even tells the two servants tells them to stay behind, probably so that they don't interfere and stop him. He tells them to stay behind, but he says to them, we will come back to you. And I think that's an indication that Abraham the whole time believed that God was somehow, we're both going to come back down the mountain. I don't understand how. I don't know what God is doing, but somehow God is going to be true to his word. He told me that this is the son. He told me that Ishmael is not the son, that it's this one. So Abraham demonstrates, I think, this great faith, this great trust in God when it really doesn't make sense what God is doing. And that's what Romans 4 is talking about, this unwavering faith that Abraham had. He did not waver at the promises of God. God's promises seemed incredible. They seemed outrageous, these great promises that he's given. And Abraham, at so many different points, wasn't able to see how God was going to bring these things about. But he was unwavering in his faith. He continued to follow God, continued to trust him all the way through. And so that's where we ended the week, and to encourage the students to see that and to think of that. I told them, when you go, as you're driving around this summer, as you're going on vacation, different things, we live in a great part of the world in the Pacific Northwest where there are lots of mountains. And every time you see the mountains, you should think, God provides. God always provides, and he's always true to his promises. These stories point ahead to Jesus. They teach us about Abraham's faith, but also they teach us about God's faithfulness. Not only did Abraham have unwavering faith, God was faithful to his word the whole time. And that's something that, as Christians, we really can rest in.
Well, that's an encouraging place to end. Thank you again for all the work you've done for VBS, and we look forward to having it again next year.
I hope so. Thanks.